Dedicated to the survival of American democracy in an increasingly dangerous world, this is Secure Freedom Radio with Frank Gaffney, acted as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy under President Ronald Reagan, founder of the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C., the go-to man for defense and foreign policy issues, joined by the greatest minds in the security policy business, the special forces in the war of ideas at Secure Freedom Radio with Frank Gaffney.
Welcome to Secure Freedom Radio. This is Frank Gaffney, your host and guide for what I think of as an intelligence briefing on the war for the free world. A man who has played an outsized role in that war for decades and who has brought both uncommon intelligence of his own and worked assiduously within the U.S. intelligence community, as well as all of the most important special forces units of the United States military, with great distinction and with not a few decorations for his troubles, is our first guest. His name is Lieutenant General William Jerry Boykin, United States Army retired. He completed his public service to date as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence in the U.S. Defense Department. He also has gone on to become the Executive Vice President of a marvelous organization, the Family Research Council. He is an author. He is a remarkable patriot and, among other things, an ordained minister and a good friend of mine and of this program. We're always honored to have him with us. General, welcome back to Secure Freedom Radio. Thank you. I'm so glad to have you too, sir, because you were actually in that job as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, I believe, certainly in the early days of the Afghan response to what happened to us almost exactly 20 years ago on 9/11. Give us your assessment, if you would, sir, before we turn to what's happening on the ground at the moment. But, you know, what was the thinking at the time? What was the nature of the mission that we set about to accomplish then? And how did it go?
Well, that we set out to accomplish?
Yes, in response to the 9/11 attack.
Well, clearly we were there to kill bin Laden, kill or capture bin Laden, I should say, to make that sound a little better. To kill or capture bin Laden and to drive the Taliban out of Afghanistan and drive them into places where they would be less effective at being able to mount operations against the American homeland or America's interest anywhere. So the whole idea was to go in and link up with CIA entities who had recruited major fighting forces in there over a period of time.
Specifically the Northern Alliance, I guess, right?
Yeah, the Northern Alliance, Dostum. Yeah, Dostum being one of them, but there was also one coming out of the South, which is the very one that brought Karzai back in. They picked him up in Pakistan, brought him back in, but there was a lot of fighting, and in the first 3 months, you can really say October, November, and December, we had major success in every city and every province that America fought in, and it didn't take very long before we really could say that we, along with our Afghan allies, really held the country. Now, what we did then was not good. And what we did then was we went into nation building, and we turned in 2003, March 2003, we turned the leadership of the military forces there over to NATO. And that is the worst thing we could have done, because the fact is NATO doesn't fight. NATO comes with their own caveats, national caveats, which tell them what their rules of engagement are going to be. And their rules of engagement are generally sit in your compound, bide your time until it's ready to come home, and don't get involved in any fighting unless you're attacked and you have to fight back. So we turned it over to NATO, and it slipped away from us. So we had a success there, and I think we turned it into a big failure.
Let me just clarify something, sir. You talked about going after bin Laden and obviously the Al-Qaeda presence in Afghanistan, and then you talked about driving out the Taliban.
If I said Taliban, I meant Al Qaeda. I really meant Al Qaeda, not Taliban. Although we did want to drive, we did want to drive them back into hiding, if you will. But we wanted to drive out Al Qaeda and kill Bin Laden, and we had driven Al Qaeda out and accomplished our mission by January of 2002. That's when we should have made our breaks and figured out what our stay behind was going to be, which in my view, Frank, should have been a counterterrorist force to protect the embassy, some trainers, a few trainers and advisors, and then a robust intelligence effort so we would know what was going on in that country, and none of that was done.
General, let me ask you one other question about this, because there's a lot of talk now about the fact that there really wasn't a country so much as there were tribes all over the country. And a central part of the nation-building project came to be, as you know so well, trying to make a country out of it, trying to create a centralized government that would sort of run everything, which it seems, with few exceptions, meant that we weren't working the problem at the local level as we should have. I'm thinking of the CORDS program in Vietnam, for example, and I guess it was called the Village Stability Operations Initiative in Afghanistan. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the central concept of what we were trying to do there once this thing turned into something other than, a punitive response and cleanup operation?
Well, unfortunately, we didn't stay with that concept long enough. In terms of parallels to the CORDS program in Vietnam, what we were trying to do was pacify and bring military materiel that would allow these villages, under the leadership of the local village elder, allow them to protect themselves, to fight back against the Taliban or Al Qaeda or anybody else. And then we sort of backed away from that, and we wanted to make them a nation, as you say, and making them a nation is something that many countries have tried, going all the way back probably to Genghis Khan, but they are not a nation. They are a tribal society. Their allegiance, their focus is on the tribal leadership. And then we wrote a constitution. This is what's really bad. We wrote their constitution. We sat down and wrote them a constitution with them there, and supposedly with their assistance. And it started out as the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. What does that tell you? What that tells you is, first of all, we don't know a darn thing about what we're doing here. Secondly, it tells you that they're going to live under Sharia. That's what they were doing before we got there. They were living under Sharia. That's what gave them the authority to brutally murder women. And that just shows that either we were trying to be too politically correct or we didn't know what we were doing. And I think it's both.
Yeah. Noah Feldman, I believe the Harvard law professor, was the guy who was the prime mover behind that Sharia constitution. And we're obviously going to watch the Taliban revert to that, I think, now. That brings me, if I could, General, to sort of what we've been witnessing in what I'm calling the Biden bug out. When you look at the consequences of the pronouncement he made back, I think, in May or so, for the country or the people of Afghanistan, more to the point, it's obviously going to be a nightmare. But I'd like you to talk, if you would, a little bit about how it's likely to be a significant problem for us as well.
Well, first of all, you can bet that the Chinese and the Russians are going to exploit this situation. In fact, they have already signaled their willingness to work with the Afghans. So that is a problem because Afghanistan, believe it or not, has a lot of minerals and resources that have not been exploited, and the Chinese have said that they're willing to go in and help them to find their resources and to exploit those resources for the revenues that come from that. So that's a major problem because you're ceding this area literally to the Chinese, and then think of the other thing as to how the world is watching us to see what kind of ally we're going to be in their conclusion is not a very good one. They've seen this before. Any of them that know history, they've seen us do this before. 20 years, and we're pulling out. So what does that mean? That means the Russians and the Chinese are licking their chops at the same time that probably Taiwan and the Ukraine are shaking in their boots, because they figure if they're not under Biden's leadership, if they're not willing to stand with an ally they've put a lot of blood and treasure into, like Afghanistan, then they're not going to do anything if we go in and take Taiwan or if we take Ukraine. They're not going to do anything. They're going to complain. They're going to go to the UN, but what we see right now is about the height of what they're going to do. And I think it's a sad day in American history that we have lost our credibility worldwide, as people see what's going on here. And having an ally that we could truly rely on in the future for anything, I think is going to be a one-off. If we ever have one, it's going to be an odd situation.
Because they know we're an unreliable ally, those countries. Yeah, and the Chinese, General, as you know, are already signaling that they're now, well, not just going through a ramped-up series of threatening activities vis-a-vis Taiwan, but they're actually pointedly telling the Taiwanese, you can't rely on the United States, you better make a deal with us, which of course will mean, the end of Taiwan as a sovereign and free nation, much as we've seen others enslaved by the Chinese Communist Party. Your point about Ukraine is very telling too, and that is it may not be just Ukraine. It may be those Baltic states that the Russians have had their eye on as well. And all of these are nations that are clearly part of the free world and that we ought to be standing with, reliably so. General, that brings me to sort of the impact of all of this on our own armed forces. You are one of the distinguished general officers who signed a letter organized under the banner of Flag Officers for America. And I commend you and your colleagues for the very, very, I think, clear-eyed and clarion call that was issued back, I guess, originally in May. Now, some 219 of you, I think, have participated in this exercise. Talk a little bit about, if you would, the object of that exercise and the warning that you all issued, and then we'll talk specifically about sort of how this is playing out for your comrades in arms still in the uniform.
Well, to begin with, we really started in September. We wrote a letter in September before the election saying that we stood with Trump, and we saw some real possibilities for bad things to happen under the Biden administration. We were concerned about a plethora of things. And we kind of laid out what we were concerned was going to happen. Well, that was the point of it, that this was probably the most important election in our lifetimes. And if it didn't go, if it went the way that we were projecting and hoping that it wouldn't go, that it was putting us on a path to really ending this constitutional republic that we all love and took an oath to the Constitution of. And then what we did in May was we said, okay, we told you that this was going to happen, and here are the things. And we laid out all the things that we see happening, starting with the integrity of the electoral process. And we went on to talk about the border. We went on to talk about the exploitation of our military. And we talked about Joe Biden's fitness to be the commander in chief. And we laid it out very clearly. And everything we said was true. So there was really never any pushback saying it was not true, that we had made up things or anything else. We pointed out exactly what was happening, what's going on in this country. And when you look at the letter that we wrote, and you do a detailed analysis of that letter, what you see there is you see things that in this country which combined are changing us from being that constitutional republic that we were created to be in more of a dictatorship. We are becoming more like a Marxist nation, and we're right now the tactics that are being used against us, the American people, You can find them in the playbook of the Marxist playbook, and that's what's happening. That's what's unfolding in America right now. And people are getting it. They just don't know what to do now. And our next step, Paul, Frank, you got to be part of this. What's our next step? Our next step has to be to start laying out for people a plan of what they can do and to preserve this constitutional republic. And I'm not advocating, let me be real clear, that people find their AR-15s and get out in the streets and start shooting. That's not the plan. But the plan has to be well thought out and executed in the proper fashion so that we preserve our values, the values that our founding fathers left for us.
Well, you've said many things that are worthy of further drill down in the shortness of time. Let me just say, in your letter of May, you talked about the nation being in peril. And as you said, you went through a number of different ways. And I was struck by one of your colleagues, Gary Harrell, told me that, like you, he and others on that letter were trained as Green Beret. And one of the things that you've had to contend with over the years is Marxists determined to take down countries. And these are examples of the way that gets done. And to the extent that's the purpose of enemies foreign and domestic, which you swore that oath to protect and defend our Constitution against. It's a really powerful, powerful message, and I commend everybody to Flag Officers number 4 America, flagofficersforamerica.org, to see this open statement, reflect on it. And General, I couldn't be more excited about or enthusiastic about the idea, and happy to help in any way I can, needless to say, to help lay out that plan of what do we do about it, and to see your team, fill what I think is a yawning leadership vacuum. And I hope that will be forthcoming. Let me just ask you, closing, sir, very quickly about one thing that is in that letter that I know is on your mind that you touched on a moment ago, but especially against the backdrop of what has to be a body blow to the morale of the U.S. military, watching what's happening now in Afghanistan, is this whole campaign aimed at, well, for want of a better term, fundamentally transforming the military, whether it's with this so-called critical race theory training or purging people from the uniformed services. Talk a little bit about the condition of the United States Armed Forces at the moment as you see it, sir, and what really specifically needs to be done in that department.
I think the military is leaderless right now in terms of a real leader, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I think, has discredited himself to the point that he really needs to be replaced. I don't think the Secretary of Defense is providing the best advice to the president as the commander-in-chief. I think that he needs to be replaced. I think that, and there's probably others in there that need to be replaced. And when you look at that testimony that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs gave, and he talked about white rage. He was interested in white rage. And then, he got off on talking about he wanted to understand what would cause people to breach the Capitol. None of that had anything to do with the military. None of it. I've never seen white rage in the military. In fact, I just asked another general yesterday, have you ever seen it? He said, no, I don't know what he's talking about. I've never seen white rage. By statute, this man is the senior advisor to the president on all things military. And instead, he's focused on white rage, which he can't even define, doesn't know what it is, and he's talking about people. He wants to know why people went in the Capitol that day. That was not a military issue. And his responsibility by statute is to give the advice to the president on all things military. He's a senior advisor. He doesn't command anything. He's the senior advisor to the president. And I didn't hear anything there about military readiness or being able to fight and win wars. Therefore, I think that it's time for him to move on.
Agreed. General, we have to let you move along for today. Thank you so much for joining us, sir, and for, again, your leadership over the years, both in uniform and now at the Family Research Council. It's deeply appreciated, needless to say, urgently needed. Keep up the great work, my friend. Come back to us again soon if you would. Jeff Nyquist joins us. We'll get a strategic overview of what we're facing straight ahead.